The state of the world is pretty dire, to be honest, and I think that that's why it's a huge responsibility to be living in a time like this, because we are sort of the last generation to be able to do anything about, or try to at least doula the new world into order, basically. So what we're living through is sort of this poly crisis, which is also a meta crisis, but I'll explain what the difference is in a minute. But like the poly crisis is sort of these compounding crises that together make a much more sort of severe crisis on its own. And basically the crisis consists of many different things, but of course the climate crisis, where we have breached 7 out of the 9 planetary boundaries, which are those boundaries that are keeping the environment and the sort of ecosystem intact in the stable Holocene period that we are in now. So we are slowly eroding that, getting into what we think might be a hot house Earth, where it's going to be almost impossible to live on a large part of the globe, and which will cause huge migration. But at the same time, we're living in a period where we've never been more connected than ever, but we've also never been more lonely and sick. So we also created this incredibly unhealthy society. And at the same time, inequality is rising. More and more people live in absolute poverty, which is also an interesting thing, right? Because that's also what you're told, that capitalism alleviated people from poverty. But that's actually not true, because that's only because we have a false low number of what absolute poverty means. Because if you were to actually say how many people live for $5.50 a day, you would see that number has actually increased. So it's only people that were below 2 that has decreased. So I don't know anyone that would think that $5 a day, no matter what country you live in, would be enough to have a sort of a decent life. So we're also seeing sort of that erosion, our reproduction functions are reducing by 50% since the 1950s. So we are slowly eroding. All of these crises are interconnected, and basically they are all stemming from one thing. They're stemming from the system of a growth-dependent economy. So this is where things got really out of hand. But it's important to recognize that although the growth-dependent system that we've enabled, sort of capitalism now it's sort of tech feudalism, has many names, but that's sort of how things have shaped what we have now. But that's sort of the underlying structure of the poly crisis. But if you want to understand what really happened, we have to understand why sort of the crisis that is above the poly crisis, or the reason why we are in a poly crisis, is because of the crisis of meaning that we have. So let me explain what I mean by that is that before we were able to basically create surplus. And with surplus, I mean that at some point we were hunter-gatherers. We were dependent on day-to-day sort of actions together in collective groups to ensure our survival. And then as a survival mechanism, we've tried to find ways to ensure that we could generate a surplus of food so we would not die out, which is completely normal and also very sensible in the sense that we have one purpose as human beings, especially when very long time ago, was to survive. So that's the purpose of almost all life on Earth, is to keep staying alive. So what we ended up being is that we ended up inventing agriculture and cultivating the land. And what you do when you cultivate the land is essentially you store surplus. So you take a plant and then you get the energy from the sunlight and you store it in a food that you can then store for many days, or even ferment it, and you have it for longer and longer, and then you start to be able to create civilizations. So this is where we slowly entered into this way of understanding how we can live with hierarchies. But what surplus does on a more fundamental level, which I think is super interesting, is that it allows us to disconnect. When you can store all of this energy and you're not depending on the land anymore, you slowly can disconnect from the land that you were. It means that you can move from place to place because you can cultivate another place. And that sort of understanding, we never had the wisdom to understand that it's great to store surplus, but it needs to come with certain conditions. So now we have a society where you can disconnect all the time. That's also why communities are struggling. If you don't like your communities, you can just get up and leave. If you're very poor or if you're not in an underdeveloped country, you're forced to make that community work because that's all you have. Because the surplus allows you to remove yourself from the situation. And now we enter into this new crazy age where basically our biggest cultural aspiration is to not be with people. Because if you are a billionaire, you have a private jet, you live in a secluded mansion, the epitome of success is not being with people. It's the ability to completely disconnect from everything, from nature, from all of those things. So that fundamental understanding of us disconnecting from place and people is what got us here. That's why we are where we are today. And I think that is such an interesting understanding, because what does that mean? It means that if this is what we do, how do we then cultivate a culture or society that does the opposite? That understands that surplus is good for survival, but taking more than we need is like a cancer. So how can we create those actual things? And I think for me that's the point. We have to understand that if we want to get out of this crisis that we're in, and it's a dire crisis because it's gonna kill us. It is exactly like cancer. We are gonna outgrow the host, and then we don't have anything else. And I think Earth will probably be all right, but we won't as humans. That's the point. We won't be here anymore if we continue. So I think we are sort of on a trajectory for collapse. I think that's undisputable. That's what's going to happen, more or less, no matter what we see. The question is, are we going to break or are we going to bend? Are we going to end up in a situation where it's going to be so bad we have no way to respond? Or can we sort of bend the curve so the collapse will happen, but we have the scaffolding ready to adapt to those circumstances? And that will require building all of those new ways of being, sort of understanding the wisdom of only having enough, the sufficiency, understanding of the economy, all of those things. Can we do that? So that's my work, is trying to do that. How do we prepare for that? How do we enable the system or build the scaffolding ready for the collapsing to sort of doula it into a new way of living? And that's more or less where I'm coming from.
And I think you do that brilliantly in the blog post that you put out. However, it also seems to me that you're shooting, east and west everywhere. There's almost every day a new blog post from you with a new, very serious, deep topic. And I'm wondering, do you have a strategy? Are all these blog posts at some point going to form a book or a film or something that can take it to the next level?
I mean, not really in my mind, because I have how I try to work is on the two different levels. Is that for me, the blog posts and the social media is about trying to bring this cultural hegemony down, and I don't think I should be the one formulating a bigger strategy. But on the other hand, I'm trying to, in my active work with everything else I do, is to build those movements, build those systems that can take over. So they work in two very different ways, and it's true that there's a lot of things that I'm writing about, and there's a lot of different things, but for me, it's to inspire, to try to end this cultural hegemony, and then the more strategic things that I'm working on are more directly targeted as what do I want to see change and how do I want it to happen, and those things. And I think that's sort of a different lens. So I'm not gonna converge those things into one sort of key narrative. Also, because I think it's too simplistic to think that we need one narrative. I think we need one movement, but it has to be built based on understanding that all of this complexity is in the system, basically. And how to deal with it is so different from context to context. I can work from my context. That's what I can do, because this is where I am, and this is where I can build more momentum. And I can try to share my learnings, and hopefully it resonates. But there's no global way to respond to this. I don't think so, at least for my. So that no, it is just me trying to see if I can break a bit of the cultural hegemony in the way I work, at least in those ways.
However, I get a sense that you're pretty good with branding, and many of your posts are also very visual. I was wondering, because we won't get very far unless we have some new words, some new branding.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, that's a lot. That's what I work with a lot in my other work, but also of course in my writing, because we have a responsibility to turn those minority insights into majority actions, and we do that through branding and communication and management and all of those things. And I think that is what we can do to make that happen. And I think we have to remember that we are being manipulated all the time, 24/7, by huge brand agencies and by huge think tanks and all of those things, from fossil fuel lobbies and all of those things. And they're doing exactly that. They are making the wrong things seem like the right choices. And I think the climate movement has to step up and understand we can use the exact same tactics, but to defend Earth. And that's what we've been really poor at. And I think there's really a level of branding and understanding and narrative telling that we need to bring into it. But I think it's important that we don't fall into this trap that we just need a better story or we just need better branding, because of course it's going to help us, but it's not going to be the full part of it. Because then all of what we're doing would be doing my post and doing my communication, but it's not going to be enough.
Enter Joseph Gelfer from Our Fair Future in the United Kingdom, who has a very strong vision, I think, of that. He's basically saying we are at war with the polluters. That we need to really, really have a very strong rhetoric about those people who pollute the planet and basically destroy life on the Earth. So, what are your takes on what Joseph is telling us?
But I think it's right. I think we have to be careful that it doesn't become an individualistic exercise, because we are all polluters. It's easy to have simple answers to a complex problem, right? It's true that there's 10 companies that are responsible for 70% of all. But the point is that it's also too simple to say that they should just be gone, because 95% of civilization cannot live without some of those things. The fossil fuel industry also delivers plastic to our surgery or the hospitals. So I agree that there needs to be, you need to vilify like the people that are doing these bad deeds, and especially the lobby groups and all those things. Get them out, get them to have lower. I'm a little bit scared of the too simplistic mindset. I like the idea of turning green black and white, because it's very easy and it's easy to understand. I'm also a little bit scared that it might end up biting yourself in the head, because you're gonna end up. I think I love Just Stop Oil, but Just Stop Oil is a terrible slogan, because that's not what you want. Essentially, you want to stop oil, but you need to do it in a clever way. But of course, it's about branding, how you understand those things. And I think words do matter, but I think we need to be careful that the words that we end up using are not going to end up emulating the same system we did before. Because if you come with rhetoric as us versus them, I think it's very powerful. But if you use it to separate people, it's actually shitty. If you use it to basically lift people up and get them to come together, it's something else. But because you can very easily end up with a language like that ends up being as authoritarian as what we've seen now, right? So I'm in favor of everything they're doing, and I think they are trying to build the movement. I think it's very good, and I like. I would be scared that it could be a little bit too simplistic, but maybe I'm wrong. It's also I don't have all the answers, and maybe it is that simplicity we need in reality.
Are you not afraid of running out of steam yourself?
Yeah, I am. I actually 3 years ago I had an aneurysm in my brain that nearly cost me my life, and thank God I'm here today and nothing happened and I'm healthy and that's great because so one of the things I really learned from that is trying to take rest. Like rest is something you need to have, and the close relationships. And mostly one thing that I learned really the hard way is that you need to have a support system around you when you're doing this work. You need to have people that you feel like you're fighting with, because if you're fighting alone, it's incredibly lonely. And for a long time in the industry, I was fighting completely alone in Denmark against everyone, and that will just run you down. So find your tribe, find some people that you know that are actually also in this for the right reasons, and then it's a lot easier. But yes, I am, of course, I'm trying to be very mindful, and my wife is also very good at trying to get me to relax.
What's your advice to our listeners who may agree with you and who may have been following your posts or will now look some of them up in terms of what should be our next moves?
I think our next moves, and that's also what I'm really sort of doing now, is to start teaching yourself to be more social. Start getting comfortable with those, getting the social atrophy to get down and get, because once we learn those traits again, because we can train that, you know, similar to the way that they shrink, you can train yourself to be more social. And the more social you become, the easier it is to be in these things and the bigger the movements we can create. So less insights, more action, and use the action with other people. And I think one of the coolest things is to do something with other people, start a food bank or community grid or just like a book club or whatever it is where you sit together, because that's gonna change. And I think one of the insights that I found so interesting in my early sort of work was that it's actions shape our values. It's not the other way around. So we often think that we have to sort of think our way into a new way of being, but it's actually you have to act yourself into a new way of being. So the moment you start doing these things, sort of starting a book club or doing a food co-op or those things, it might not be something, not because you're super green or care about it, but it's a self-reinforcing mechanism. Once you do those things, you start to identify as those things. So the best thing you can do as anyone that is in that space or want to try to do something and don't know what to do is just make some micro actions, and don't make them excuses. Don't make it like, now I've done this, then I don't have to do something. Make something that you think is fun, that will reinforce you later, and aim it at collective action rather than individual efforts. So that means getting together with others to do something, not just recycling more or something that is an individual effort. Make it collective. So that's how we create sort of the ripple effects, because then other people see you doing this with other people, and then they get inspired to do it, and then it starts all of these things. So that I would say, start seeing more people, having more good times, and working on this together.
That should be easy. It sounds very nice.
Yeah, it's not so easy, to be honest, but I think that's the reason why it's not so easy is that in a modern day life, you know, time is what we don't have. That's, you know, it's everyone is stressing, running 9-to-5 jobs, 2 kids, cooking, all of those things. So you barely have time to even see your friends. So how do I get time to do this? And one of the things that I've been privileged enough to do is that I read a book by Kate Saber, which is called Post-Growth Living. And that really changed my life quite a lot, actually, because in that one, she tells you to find the enjoyment in things that are less consuming. And then she tells you to try to reorganize your life so you're not dependent on those consumptions. So basically, try to scale down as much as you can on how you live. So for me, it meant that we don't have a car, we don't fly on holidays, I bike everywhere, so does my wife. and all of those things. And we live in a small apartment. We should probably get a bigger one, but we chose not to, because then we can work less and then we have more time. And the thing is that those choices seem pretty radical because all our friends are getting big apartments, and to be honest, it's difficult. But at the end of the day, I'm the one that works part-time. My wife does too. We have more time to be with the people we care about. And when I'm dead at some point, hopefully in the future, I will be remembering the time that I spent with my friends and not the new car I got. And I think that's the thing we need to keep telling ourselves. So I think it's easy for me to say, because I'm super privileged and I've been able to live I still have an apartment, I can do. So it's not for everyone, but for the people that can do it, I would urge you to do it, because it's actually quite nice and you get a lot more time. Then the next question is that you've been indoctrinated your whole life to not have any time. So when you then have it, what do you then do? That becomes the next problem. But I think for me that's then use it on social stuff, organizing, being with others, all of those things. Then that becomes fun.
Born in Denmark, trained as an architect, Kasper's own journey from the design studio into climate activism began with one single question: how could creative work serve life rather than the systems eroding it? And that's a question that leads directly into what comes next, and his whole rethinking of the human story itself.
I studied architecture and I ran a research and design department in architecture for the last 8 years. But around 8 years ago or something, I coincidentally got an assignment from a Stanford professor saying, we need to sort of make a completely self-sufficient way of living, because we won't really have a planet to live on in the future. And I was like, this was the first time I knew there was something called climate change, but it wasn't something that was really on my mind, because that's not what I was taught in architecture school. And I started researching, and as you know, it's a rabbit hole, and it got scarier and scarier. And sort of in that process, I became radicalized. And of course, when we did the project, and it turned out that it was actually feasible to create a small community for 50 people that could be completely self-sufficient with anything from food to energy. And we sort of ended up putting it out there, and it went completely viral. It had 45 million views, and I thought okay, there must be something to this. I think because for me it has been a learning journey, and what we were sort of showing was also something that clearly resonated with people. So I started studying, and I started developing this research department further and further, and it became more and more progressive as I realized how sort of bad things actually were. But and I was sort of living quietly with trying to say, can I try to steer the industry from within, trying to change it. And then I read a book called How to Blow Up a Pipeline, which is one of my favorite books by Andreas Malm, which is basically arguing that there's never been a social movement that had any sort of actual success unless there was a radical flank to ensure that it sort of pulled momentum and dragged the Overton window in the right direction. And I decided, okay, maybe I can be that flank, because I don't care about being listened to. What I care about is trying to do something that actually helps the environment and my kids. I have 2 kids now. I had one at the time. So it became sort of this way for me to do this. So I started being very vocal about all of these things, which was very not appreciated by my employer at the time. And actually not anyone in the industry, because people thought I was a troll, and it was because no one likes to be told that what they're doing is wrong. But it was sort of the way it was, and I just kept doing it because I thought we need to get this message out there. So that was sort of my entrance into this. So I sort of gradually left corporate architecture to become sort of a radicalized architect. And then in November last year, I quit my job to start my own nonprofit to work on mobilizing basically people into creating actual change, which is sort of a combination of the skills I have as an architect and the research that I've acquired over many years. So that's more or less my journey and where I'm at right now.
So what's your plan? Because shouting out into the internet, cyberspace in itself is probably not going to do it, is it?
No, I mean, I think there's many things. I think often as activists or people working in this space, we sort of tend to think that we have to have one box, that's what we stick to. But it's basically all strategies has to be deployed at the same time. So what I've done is that I read Gramsci, which one of my favorite authors, and one of the key points he has is that the cultural hegemony is something that the elites use to ensure that no one actually rises or creates any sort of revolutionary ideas. So there is this point, and for me that was to use social media and the media landscape to push the agenda and to break up this cultural hegemony, because we need to understand that the overarching things that we are told are basically lies that serve one elite. So the idea that growth is always good, that if you're poor, it's something of your own undoing, you should just work harder, and all those things. We need to counteract those prevailing myths, because they are basically just keeping us from really understanding what's going on. So that's one leg of it. But at the same time, I have been doing the research and have been mobilizing an entire industry in Denmark through our effort called the Reduction Roadmap, where we actually got the entire Danish industry to ask politicians, and when I mean the entire industry, I really mean the entire industry, like from the small scale green carpenter to the biggest developer in the Nordics. We all came together and asked the politicians to ensure that we had climate targets that we needed to obey by, in order so we could adhere to the Paris Accord, which was, I think, the first time, at least in the history I know, where its entire industry has asked to be regulated so heavily that it would meet the Paris Accord climate budgets. So that's one thing. So that's, screaming out doesn't do anything unless you also act on it. So it's about creating the movements, and at the same time, I've done a degrowth transition plan with my colleagues for the entire industry to show that it is possible to get back. And I was one of with Velux and Artelia and my former employer, I also developed the building with the lowest footprint ever made in Denmark that could be built at scale. So my work has been sort of very hands-on, from movement building to communication. So it's not just one thing, it's a lot of things at the same time I'm trying to do.
So what I'm curious about is if we broaden the perspective out from just Denmark, where you have been very active, to the world, and talk about solutions for our planet Earth, and humanity. What do you see is the main obstacle? What are the problems as you see it, and what are the solutions? That's even more important.
Yeah, I think there's just two major problems that I see, and the first is that the scientific community, or the people actually understanding how the system dynamics works, are incredibly poor at getting it translated to people. So we have all the knowledge that we need, it's just very poorly distributed. So one of the things that has been instrumental in my work, and also something I took from architecture, is to translate those minority insights into majority actions. So I use branding and marketing techniques to sort of lobby for these, to get them into the mainstream. And that was incredibly successful with Reduction Roadmap, which is why it happened and why we could do the mobilization. So I think one of the things is that we are locked in this system where we can't really seem to get out of the scientific community out to the wider society. So I think that's one thing that we're really missing, and one thing that I'm working on trying to change. And the other thing is that I think it's Sarah Stein Lubrano wrote an incredible book. It's called Don't Talk About Politics. I hope that's the title. But the thing is, where she says something that I really, really like, and that's one of the reasons why we are in this situation is because of something called social atrophy. And she's a neuroscientist, so she studied the brain. And social atrophy is actually because when we spend less time with each other, which has happened throughout the last 50 to 70 years basically, because our life has been more and more individualized and we've sort of removed all the places we used to meet each other. So the third place in the States was the bowling alley, in Denmark it was football clubs, and all those things, they have been sort of stripped away. So we have less social connections and we see people less and less basically in daily life, which means that our frontal cortex is shrinking, making us less good at actually engaging in social activities. And when we are less good at doing something, we tend to not do it. That's also why it's harder to mobilize people now than it was a long time ago, because it takes more effort for people to be in social circumstances that they're not used to. And I mean, as a Dane who's from a culture that's incredibly reserved, it's very apparent here that we are very bad at being social with people we don't know. So, and I think that's a key thing, that when we've taken away those third places and those social connections, it becomes harder and harder. So that's also something we have to rebuild. So basically we have to learn how to get people to understand those basic principles that are what science is telling us. And at the same time, we have to learn how to work together and be together in order to start movement building. Because one thing is how to mobilize, which you can do through communication, but a movement cannot be sustained unless you can have like a social connection. And so that's, and I would argue that's also why we're seeing protests today that have no effect. And we see hundreds of thousands, even million people on the street, yet the political power is completely quiet. And I think the difference is today is that before those mobilizations were rooted in movements that sustained pressure over time. Now they become sort of events that people attend and then disperse from. So there's basically only that one time when we are in a movement and we say we're unhappy, but then the pressure sort of fizzles out for the politicians. But to be able to get the political movements to actually change, momentum has to be sustained continuously. And that's what movement does. So I think we have this very weird understanding that mobilization and movements are the same, but it's really not the same. Movements are consistent, they are a social group, they have strong relational dynamics, and they keep pressure on the political sort of elites. Whereas mobilizations can very quickly turn virtue signaling for something that people just want to do. So I think that's the difference, and that we have to bridge that gap. And I think that's what I'm trying to do with the work I'm doing, trying to come at it from those two angles. One thing that's important with those movements and how you actually enable the mobilization is that it's not about tweaking the existing system. It's about actually being a force of power to sort of counter it or resist it. I think Julia Steinberger says it very well when she says, stop appealing to power, start mobilizing to counter it. And I think that's exactly what we need to do. I think that is it's not about tweaking the system, it's about building a coalition strong enough to overtake it. And that's what we need to do, basically. And that's also, why I believe that movements are essential, because it's only through those movements we can be powerful enough to overthrow the current elites.
And it's easy to say, Kasper, but how do we do it then?
Yeah, I think that's the really interesting part, I think, because I think one of the things I studied a lot, and when we worked with intensively in how we mobilized with the reduction roadmap, was looking at how social tipping point actually works and how actual system dynamics function. So typically you would say that you just need the bigger influencers, you need the big lobby groups to come with you, and then you will enforce it. But actually that's not how change actually happens, because the people in the center of power are least likely to actually change their minds because they benefit from status quo. So if you want to enable a successful mobilization that can then turn into a movement, you have to collect the periphery. It means that you don't go about this in the way that you just need as broad a coalition as possible. What you basically need is you need to engage with all the people that are close to being on the fence. So the people that you have had the easiest time persuading. And a good example of how we did this for the roadmap was that we said, we can go out with this pledge that everyone should sign and we should ask the politicians for, or we can also do something different. We can contact all the ones that are the most ambitious and are probably going to support this in a forum before we go out with this, so we can talk about and get them on board. So we basically take the periphery and organize that before. So we did that, and we had and everyone was on board, and it was great. And once that happened, then we went live with our campaign. All of a sudden, you had very quickly a lot of signups. It just went crazy, and then the center of power gets really scared, because now they can see a shift in what the social norms are getting at. And then everyone sort of said, I can't be left out. The FOMO kicks in. We're all basically school kids at the playground. We want to fit in. And then that happens. So I think this is how we enable that mobilization, is that we are incredibly smart in understanding how system dynamics works and how we mobilize to get the effect we need. Because trying to get endorsement from celebrities or trying to get big sort of organizations that are in the power situation right now to be part of it, it never works. They are never going to do it. They will always maybe just say they will do it, but behind their back they will do something different. So it's about organizing the periphery so it becomes large enough that the majority can't ignore it anymore. And that's sort of how we should go about it. And that's also why I think a lot of movements fail, because they think they are a broad coalition. And they aim for a broad coalition. And when you aim to be something for everyone, you become nothing for no one. And that's basically what happens. So it's about being very articulate in what do you want to do, and then putting strategic pressure on the right points and organizing according to that. And I think another thing that has been very instrumental, and at least the work that I've been trying to do, is that there's been this tendency in the climate movement, and I think the climate movement has actually done some amazing work. There's been so many. I'm still in awe every time I see the young people blocking the streets, and what they're doing is just, in my mind, they are the actual true heroes of this century. But one thing I think that's been missing in the climate movement is the understanding of how successful movements has actually happened in the past. Because if you look back into civil rights movement, for example, they always had the goal of equal rights, but it was not what they asked people to follow immediately. They asked for small steps toward a goal, which was equal rights. So first it was to end segregation, which they mobilized around, which is a very simple thing to say, please mobilize with us for this thing to end this. And then when people start mixing, because segregation, it's easier to move on to the next step, which was positive affirmation, so voting rights and getting into schools and so forth. So it continued. And I think that's what the climate movement never got, is that's the stepping stone. And for me, it was the same with reduction roadmap. Reduction roadmap it was just one step. It's not at all enough. So now the next step, which we also launched in Denmark, is building stop. Stop building new buildings. We don't need more of them. And then after that, it becomes redistribution. And then until you end up with a building industry that works on not the benefit of financial interest, but the benefit of the people. And you just have to lay that plan out and try. But I also want to be honest, I've tried to mobilize a million times and failed. I've tried to do, it's a trial and error game. It's not something you can put on a formula. It's difficult. It's hard work.
Some of the blog posts you put out are really deep, I feel, where you're touching on things such as how we govern. Recently you had a post which was about opposite power in a way. Can you explain what you were saying there?
Yeah, it's the reverse dominance hierarchy, which is a theory coined by, I actually forgot the the name of the original author. I'll come back to that. But it's the idea, and we know it from our friend groups and also actually from anarchism, but anarchism has been sort of always told as the story of no law and order, and we're all gonna sort of live in sort of Mad Max society. But the idea is that when we are in a healthy friend group, no one governs over each other. No one has the dominance, basically. And if someone tries to be the dominant one, they are very quickly sort of to be put down by the other through sort of jokes or getting ridiculed, or even worst case sort of shunned from the group. But basically, we have these mechanisms in our society and actually in our evolutionary traits that we know how to ensure that these things can be put in place, so no one actually goes outside the boundaries. So if we've done that, and actually there's evidence from David Graeber wrote a book with an anthropologist that I also forget his name of, called The Dawn of Everything, which goes through archaeological findings that show that we lived in population of million people, cities, without any form of sort of hierarchical structures, all egalitarian. So we've actually have been able to live like this before. So these reverse dominance hierarchies is about understanding that if we set up the system that we live in the right way, so those power traits which our economy is now, are not prevalent, we can actually enable a society where we don't need the hierarchical structures that are sort of causing us so much pain today. Because today there's no way you can live outside this sort of you live in a hierarchical, our entire system is based on this, surplus buys you freedom to govern over others, and that's basically how the system works. So we can, at the same time, figure out, if we know how we got here, what's the reverse way to break that power down, so there is not going to be that. And for me, one of the most important things is how you govern is completely skewed, in that today it's money that controls both politics but also the means of production. So basically there is no democratic voice in any of the capitalism we see today. So there's very few companies that are democratically owned. They're run by shareholders or for profit, and you can't really ridicule a CEO to stop being bad to the environment. That's not how it works, unfortunately. So ways to get around this is to take the power and get the sort of democracy into those means of production by either having corporations that are owned by the workers themselves, or if you have even a governance structure in politics that are not politicians or no lobbyist group, but basically are citizen assembly that are chosen randomly and advised by experts to do this thing. And we know, which is really interesting, we know when we've done those citizen assemblies, that when they are, even though they come from a completely a big variety of people that are same as the general demography of a country, they end up making incredibly progressive political points and strategies, because they're not influenced by any means to keep the power. They're just there for a fixed period, and they listen to the expert because they know they don't know, and they can, they are human beings that want the best for other human beings. Whereas in our current system, we have politicians that have all these ulterior motives, and it's all about keeping the power. It's all about the interests that they have, and that's what makes it impossible. So I think dismantling those things are key in enabling this reverse hierarchy, reverse dominance hierarchy, and at the same time ensuring that people have a green job guarantee, so people sort of are not going to be left poor and alone in this. So we need the social structures to really ensure that there's no one sort of dominating anymore. So I think that is a really crucial thing to think about. But again, this is where I would like us to go, but it will take steps to dismantle the system to get there. And thinking that we can just ask for all of these things immediately, I don't think is a good strategy, because I think it will fail quite quickly.
However, we need a story. We need something that we can gather around. We need to tell people something. So in a short way, what's your story? How would you get me excited about your vision?
Yeah, I mean, the thing is that I don't think we should tell a vision. I don't think because if you're a mom struggling to get by, the idea of a utopian dream far in the future is just not gonna get me off my couch. my vision is to build so strong movements that people want to be in them for the friendship, for the group, for the social things, to make that the aspirational thing to be wanting. Not the idea of hopefully we get a better future, but to get a better future here and now by doing this work. And I think that's what's missing, and that's what we continuously fail to deliver on. We say like, come do all of these things, take out your weekends, and it's almost like a chore you have to do in order for hopefully getting a better future, instead of saying, no, this is a place where you meet people that are excited about this, that you vent with. So it's like the cognitive dissonance that you're wrestling alone with, because being in this space is actually quite lonely if you don't have anyone else. So for me, the vision is to get people to understand the big positive benefits there are from actually doing this work and doing it with other people. And then putting aside it's not that we shouldn't have a nice vision, it's just that it's not what we need to mobilize around. Because of course we all want a better future, and a future where our kids grow up actually surviving. I think that's the hope, right?
Exactly. So what keeps you going personally? Because you seem to be putting a lot of energy, time, and with time also money, I guess, into this.
Yeah, I mean, I'm fortunate enough to have my own non-profit, but where I thankfully have some nice clients that help me and that I work with to do all this meaningful work. But what gets me going is basically that I don't know how I could get up in the morning if I weren't trying to do something about it. Because once you have the knowledge, it's really hard to unsee it. You can't just leave it anymore. It's like, I guess you have the same. That's also why you do what you do. Is that if you know these things, it's too painful to stop, basically. I will say, and also being honest, is that sometimes I wish that I didn't know all of these things, to be honest, because my life would be much more stress-free if I didn't have to understand that my kids might not grow up to have a full life. But that's the sad reality. So all I can do is try to work as hard as I can to do something about it, basically.
And are you optimistic?
No, I mean, I think like many other people, I've been going back and forth in this. You have periods where it seems impossible, and you have periods where you feel like, oh, there's momentum, we can maybe change something. I'm not really super optimistic, but I'm hoping that in the collapse, which is going to happen, we can find the strength to create a new system that's much more beautiful than the one we're living with now. And I think it's a very weird thing that we sort of think of this system as something that's good. So it's almost like we're trying to preserve it. It's like we're trying to work towards like nothing should change because this is great. But in reality, it's great for very few people. The majority is living in the hellish conditions, so that me and everyone else in the global north can live sort of a hyper-consumed life that's making even us miserable. And I think there is a hope for me in that I believe that there's a much more beautiful way to live together that's not this system. And that's what I hope we can emerge. But it requires us to build the systems or the scaffolding to create the new sort of world. And that's what I'm sort of really interested in trying to do now, is that getting those movements, getting those understandings of how we interact with each other, how do we reverse the power structures, all of those things. So when things collapse, we have our system ready to take over when the old one crumbles. And that's my sort of dream. And that's what makes me hopeful, actually. One of the people that has inspired me most is a Danish environmental economist called Inger Røpke. And she says, on a finite planet with finite resources, we basically only have two options. It's either to fight or to share. And once we understand that, then I know what I prefer. And I think that it all boils down to this. That's what it is. It means that if there's a limited number of resources on the globe that we can split evenly, either we can go through it through dominant hierarchies where we outcompete each other, or go to war for these things until sort of there's one victor, or we can basically choose to say, how do we collectively share this to create a system where we're all sort of actually living the best possible life with the means that we have. And we've chosen the fight mode, but maybe we should start understanding that it's about the sharing, and that's where we have to go. I think that's the future, and the more we know and understand that, the better it is, because we are all interconnected. We are part of the web of life. I'm no different than a tree. Like, we live in the same system. We are codependent. So you can choose to fight, but at some point it will be your own destruction that you are sort of enabling. So that's the key. Choose to share, because it brings reciprocity to everyone.